Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, so switching gears a little bit, going to be talking about, kind of the big issue that I've been dealing with over the last year and a half, and that's roof rats in our orchard systems. So, thought we'd start off, with a little bit of introductory material here. Unfortunately, it looks like our video is not working, but if you look closely, you'd see that one of the types of damage that rats cause is feeding on the nuts and fruits that are up in the trees. That's one of the more common forms of damage we see. We also see them girdle the branches of trees, which is a big problem because then you lose, the production for the rest of the life of that particular tree. So that's problematic. I would say, at least in our nut orchards, the biggest culprit as far as amount of damage that we see from rats is the feeding on the irrigation lines, which results in millions of dollars lost annually throughout the state. And they also pose a potential food safety risk as well as the potential for disease transmission to humans. So lots of potential problems with rats. Now, when it comes to managing rats, one tool that we can use that is effective is the use of rodenticides, particularly rodenticides used up in bait stations. But to maximize the efficacy of our management programs, we of course want to utilize an integrated approach. We want to mix in some other tools to use with these rodenticides, not to mention that there are more and more restrictions on the use of rodenticides, and so we definitely need to mitigate their use to some extent as well. So what are some of these alternative options that we have? Habitat modification is one thing we can think about. I always think about habitat modification first when it comes to managing rodent pests. With habitat modification, we're talking about altering desirability of an area for a particular pest. There are limits to what we can do, though, on this front with orchards. With rats, the trees are the preferred habitat, right? So we can't get rid of them. What we can do is look at some of the brush or pruning piles that we have around these orchard systems and remove those. So that's one step that we can take. But otherwise, there's limits to that when it comes to rat control in orchards. Fertility control is another one that we hear more and more about. The potential use of chemostimulants and other related products. There is something out there. There is a product called Evolve that can be used in orchards as a rat fertility control mechanism, but it really hasn't been tested yet. And the other potential downside with fertility control is that you're basically waiting for the rats to die on their own, right, and then not replace themselves, which means you're going to continue to experience damage. So something that I haven't looked at yet, although I may look at in the future. Biocontrol, with biocontrol, talking about the use of natural predators to control pest populations, barn owls being one potential option there. This is an avenue that we are currently exploring, and there may be some potential utility for barn owls to reduce rat populations, but it hasn't been looked at extensively yet. Burrow fumigation, the use of toxic gases in burrow systems pose one potential option. Things like aluminum-phosphide gas cartridges, pressurized exhaust, CO2. Those are all avenues that could be explored, as well as trapping. Trapping's been used to manage rats for a large number of years, but we still don't have much information about how effective that can be in orchard systems either, or at least we hadn't until recently. So with that, I want to segue into a study that I've completed recently, and no, you're not in the wrong place. I know this is a Pistachio meeting, and this is a reference to a citrus project, but I got involved in a project looking at rat control in citrus a few years ago, and I'm glad I did because it kind of got ahead a little bit of some of these problems in nut orchards, and it provided us at least a baseline with which to work from. So I want to highlight some of what we found from this citrus research project and how that can be used in nut orchard systems. So with this particular project, what we did was we initially established 4 objectives. The first one being, we need an effective way to monitor rat populations, both to determine how effective some of these management tools are, but also to provide us with a tool to monitor for these numbers over time. Secondly, we wanted to assess activity patterns for roof rats. We really didn't know anything about rats in these orchard systems. How far are they moving? When are they active? Where are they hanging out? This was all important information in order for us to more effectively target that particular species. We also wanted to determine the efficacy of a 0.005% difascinone product, which is the typical product used for rat control. but we really didn't have any data on how effective that would be in citrus. And then lastly, like I mentioned, we wanted to develop an integrated approach for managing roof rats that would incorporate rodenticides while also trying to incorporate some other tools like trapping as well as long-term monitoring. So that was the premise of this study. Like I said, the first part was to develop a monitoring strategy for rats. We really didn't have anything out there that was proven effective. So we looked at a couple of ideas initially. One of those was the use of, if my clicker and pointer works, there we go, maybe. See? Eventually we'll figure it out. So this is a tracking tunnel here. The tracking card is down below. What you do is you place this card in the tunnel. You put an ink pad in the middle with an attractant in the middle of that. What that does is that draws the rat into that particular tunnel. It steps on the ink, and when it leaves footprints behind. So then we know that rats were out there. If we establish those in a grid pattern, then we can begin to assess activity out there in those orchards. We tested this, and it worked quite well for tracking changes in rats over time. If you look at the red circle, you'll also notice an attractant we have hanging up and a camera that's targeted on that. We looked at the use of remote triggered cameras to monitor rat activity, and this also was very effective at tracking changes in rat numbers over time, but we did ultimately decide that the tracking tunnels were just easier to implement, and so that's the monitoring strategy we used moving forward. Next, like I said, we wanted to assess activity patterns of rats out there. For this, what we did is we live trapped rats, we colored them, and we released them. Yes, I know, sounds horrible. But we needed to get that movement data. And so what happened is these rats, these transmitters would emit a cellular signal. And then we had these antennas set up throughout these orchard systems. When a rat would be within a certain distance, it would ping one of those antennas. If we got enough of those antennas with signals at the same time, we could triangulate locations. And in this way, we're able to get rat location data every few seconds. So this was really innovative technology, provided really good insights into rat movements out there. If you look at the photo at the top right, you'll notice an orchard system out there with a bunch of home ranges. And you'll notice right away that rat home ranges are pretty good size. They averaged about 5.9 acres, so they do move around quite a bit. And you'll notice there's substantial overlap too. So they're hanging out in a lot of the same areas. The other thing that was really interesting to note is that they stayed exclusively in those orchard systems. They didn't wander out, which is good to know because that means we can target them in those orchards and we don't have to worry too much about some of the adjacent habitats, although this is, of course, habitat dependent. If you are next to a riparian area, they're going to be moving back and forth. So it just depends on the adjacent habitats. We also found out that rats were active exclusively at night, which we anticipated, but it was interesting to note that they were exclusively active at night. We didn't have any movement data during the daytime. Okay, so now we had some information about how rats are moving out there on the landscape. Next, we wanted to test the effectiveness of a baiting program for managing rats. In this case, what we used was the 0.005% diphacinone treated oat product that's sold by some of the county ag commissioner offices. This is important to note because that is the only label that allows for use in elevated bait stations during the bearing season. So if you want to control rats utilizing a rodenticide, particularly during the bearing season, then you're going to need to utilize that specific product. And in this case, we used a specific bait station design that you see here. I'll quickly mention, though, that there's another bait station design that's currently available. Capico worked hard with CDFA, some of the county ag commissioner folks, and some other folks to get a bait station available for grower use. So if you're interested in more about that particular bait station, reach out to your county ag commissioners. They're supposed to have details on how you can get a hold of that. This particular bait station that we looked at was not commercially available at the time. Okay, so how do we implement this baiting program? Well, first of all, we used that movement data that I just talked about that we collected. So what we did is we figured out the average size of a roof rat home range. We took the radius of that to use to initially test spacing for bait stations. We want to come up with that sweet spot where we're getting enough bait stations out there to be effective, but not so many that it becomes cost prohibitive. So that distance that we came up with initially was 250 feet. So if treating a 40-acre area, that resulted in a 5x5 grid. And what you see is that our efficacy, unfortunately, was not very good. We had 12% efficacy. So we expected much better than that. We figured the spacing might be a little too wide. So again, we went back to the data that we collected. And this time what we looked at was the smallest home range that we had. We again took the radius of that home range, which was 164 feet, and then we spaced bait stations out there following that pattern. This worked much better. We had 77% reduction in rat populations following a baiting program. So now we were kind of in that realm of where we wanted to be. Incidentally, Neve Quinn and I worked on a project over 10 years ago in Fresno County utilizing these elevated bait stations with this same particular product. But in this case, we used 100-foot spacing. We used shorter spacing because we had deer mice out there as well, and the deer mice weren't moving as far. And in that case, we had 90% reductions in rat populations. So the take-home message here is that the closer the spacing between the bait stations, the more effective it's going to be. But of course, that comes with a trade-off as far as labor, materials, supplies, et cetera. So it's up for you to decide which distance you want to use. I think that 164-foot spacing was kind of that sweet spot for us. Okay, so now we had good information on how effective a baiting program was. So now it was time to develop an integrated approach. And in this case, most of these orchards that we're dealing with have extensive rat populations. So they needed something initially to knock down those populations. And so for that, we utilized this elevated bait station program. But then we wanted to come up with another approach that we could bring in so that we weren't relying exclusively on these baits, but also something that would provide long-term relief for us. So we needed something, in other words, to intercept those reinvaders when they come back onto those properties. And for that, what we proposed to use was a trapping tunnel. If you look closely, these are tunnels. They have traps on both ends. We placed them on a 2x4 and put them up in the branch of the trees. Rats come in, they get caught. And so we put those trapping tunnels up, and they were meant to be in place long term to just intercept those reinvaders as they come through. And then lastly, we wanted to utilize monitoring in order to tell how those numbers are changing over time. If those populations were to begin to spike again, we could, of course, follow up with another bait application as needed. In this case, we were utilizing those tracking tunnels. So this is the general process that we used. We're treating 40-acre areas, 40-acre orchards. We had an 8x8 spacing of bait stations separated by 164 feet. We baited for about 4 weeks, although on some sites we had more extensive rat activity, and so we had to keep those bait stations active for a longer period. Basically, if rats are coming and eating bait, you keep the bait stations out. When you start to see a substantial reduction in bait consumption, then you can take them out. This again worked well. We had a mean bait efficacy of 73%. Okay, now following the completion of that baiting program then, in the bait station only plots, we didn't do anything else. That was it. But in the IPM plots, what we then did was we implemented those trapping tunnels. Those trapping tunnels we spaced at 250 feet apart. We used wider spacing in this case because we had already substantially reduced those rat populations. In this case, all we were trying to do was keep those reinvaders from moving back in and reestablishing. So we felt like we could get away with wider spacing and reducing costs that way. So 2 months following the completion of our baiting program, what did we see? We saw that the integrated approach worked very well. We had an 88% reduction in rat populations. In other words, the traps got rid of even more rats. We went from 73% all the way up to 88% with this approach. So it worked really well. With the bait station only approach, you'll see that those populations were already beginning to rebound pretty substantially. So it definitely seemed to be working better. The interesting thing is that when we went out to 5 months, We also saw even a further reduction in rat populations with these traps in place, all the way up to 93%. But if you look closely, you'll notice that the bait station plots actually jumped up dramatically to 85%. So why is that? That's a great question, because we weren't doing any additional baiting out there. And I think the answer to this is that those bait station plots were generally right next to those IPM plots. And I think that those traps were so effective at reducing rats out there that we started to get movement from those bait station plots, rats from those bait station plots into these IPM plots, which further reduced rat populations in that entire area. So that was kind of interesting. And just to further reinforce this, with these trapping tunnels, we ended up catching 97 rats total during this study period. So these trapping tunnels, I think, were very effective and an important part of this management program. So how do these costs compare? Well, I'm not going to get into too much detail on this. It takes a little while. We're a little limited on time today. But suffice it to say, not surprisingly, for your first year, this integrated approach utilizing traps, of course, was more expensive because you had to purchase the traps primarily. And if you look closely, you'll notice that the primary expense actually is supplies. It's not labor, it's supplies. And we did see a substantial increase in supply costs that first year. But when we moved out into subsequent years, you see that on year 2, the bait station only approach cost basically the same amount as the IPM approach. So yes, there's an increased cost for that first year, but in subsequent years, that cost was the same. And we definitely believe that this integrated approach was much more effective, so worth that cost. Now, is it worth it overall? Well, I mean, I suppose this depends, situation to situation. Again, this was citrus, so we put it in perspective of citrus, but at $12 a box of lemons or oranges, basically 6 boxes per acre would have to be saved in year 1, but only 1 box per acre in subsequent years. So this seemed fairly reasonable, but it seems really reasonable if you start to consider the fact that we didn't account for damage to irrigation systems, which oftentimes are far more than the cost or the loss of direct consumption of fruit. So it does seem to be worth it in this particular scenario. Okay, so that was that citrus study. How do we tie this back into pistachios and other nut crops? Well, one thing we have to keep in mind is that with citrus is an evergreen crop. It has vegetation out there year-round. So rats, although they do occasionally utilize burrow systems in citrus, they don't use it very often. Most of the time, they're hanging out in these nests up in the trees. So we didn't really consider fumigation in this particular study as an alternative approach. But in pistachios and many other orchard crops, burrow fumigation definitely could be a viable option to consider. Things that might be used include aluminum phosphide, which is generally very effective for other burrowing rodent species like ground squirrels and gophers. We do have pressurized exhaust systems that can be used. Things like the perk machine, the Kojak, the Burrow RX are all devices that inject exhaust into burrow systems, which could be effective. And then we also have a carbon dioxide injection device called the Eliminator, which is available for use now, essentially utilizing canister CO2 that you inject into that burrow system. So all of these are potential tools we could use to manage rats in some of these other orchard systems, and there's something that I'm currently looking at right now. In fact, that's what I've been doing the first 2 days of this week, and that's what I'll be doing tomorrow. Another approach I mentioned early on were barn owls. With barn owls, we're talking about biocontrol, right? Use of natural predators to help control these pest populations. Again, we didn't really consider them to be much of a viable option in citrus because there's thick, abundant cover year-round out there. It's going to be very difficult for the owls to get in there and pick off enough rats to have a meaningful effect on those populations. But in our orchard crops, we do have much more open canopies, much more open understory. Particularly during the dormant season, it seems quite practical to assume that owls can get out there and hunt in these orchard systems. And in fact, we do see plenty of sign out there that they are. I know a number of growers have been putting up barn owl boxes and have been getting very good barn owl box occupancy rates. So it certainly is possible that owls could provide some relief for rat populations. Keep in mind, they're not going to control all of the rats for you, but they might pick off a small percentage of them. Some of the work that Matt Johnson and his lab out at Cal Poly Humboldt are showing is that in vineyard settings, they're reducing any gopher and mouse populations by anywhere from 15 to 35%. So it's a little added benefit for us, and certainly something that I think could be considered as part of an integrated approach for managing rats. And how about the use of gopher traps? This was something I kind of discovered last year as I was trying to trap rats out in one of these orchards. And I was having a hard time catching them in some of the traps that I was using. As I was walking around, I noticed these burrow systems oftentimes are about the same size as a gopher tunnel, so why not put a gopher trap down in there? Here's an example of one of those sets. I put out about 40 or so of these traps one day, came back the next day, and I had 19 rats. So it was much more effective for me in that particular situation. We've been doing some additional testing on this and have found that it is a pretty effective tool for targeting rats. It is obviously more time-consuming, so I'm not necessarily suggesting anybody would want to go through and trap hundreds of acres utilizing this approach. But again, using it as a follow-up approach whenever you see a good new fresh burrow system that pops up, you can catch them pretty effectively and easily with these kinds of gopher traps. So something else you could consider. All right, so we've kind of covered a lot of what we currently know about rats in these orchard systems. There's a lot that we're still trying to work towards too, so I certainly wouldn't take this as the final message. But as it currently stands, in these, in what we found in these citrus orchards is that utilizing an initial bait station spacing of 164 feet was very effective at initially knocking down rat populations. Then if you can follow that up with an extended trapping program, utilizing these trapping tunnels, again spaced about 250 feet, this was a very effective strategy for keeping those populations from rebounding. And again, we have lots of data that shows within 1 to 2 months following the completion of a baiting program, you'll have just about as many, and in some cases, even more rats than you had initially if you don't have some other mechanism in place to intercept those reinvaders. So this is an important step. You need something in place to keep those rats from rebounding. And then again, of course, with all pests, it's important to monitor for those populations, to know when those populations are beginning to rebound. And if you start to see a substantial uptick, then you know that you can come back in with something like a baiting program to knock down those populations once again. And we found that these tracking tunnels used every 3 to 4 months was an effective strategy for monitoring those rat populations over time. Now, this is just over a 6-month period that we studied, but we not only didn't see any increase, but we saw a further decrease. So we think that this kind of program can last long term, but of course, eventually those populations are likely to rebound. And when they do, you have some other tools like the bait application in place to deal with it. Now, in nut orchards, you have, I think, the added advantage of that there are some other tools that we can incorporate too, such as burrow fumigation. Again, we're still kind of testing how effective these burrow fumigants are, but some of them are likely to be effective at least. And I think this is another tool that you can mix into your management program to provide more lasting relief. And then I think, trying to incorporate some barn owl boxes on your property could be another way to help kind of keep those populations at a lower level. Certainly could be a good tool to help keep populations that were depressed down to low levels at low levels for a longer period of time. So something to keep in mind there too. So that's most of what I had here today. I want to close with a few different items though. Number one, I'm always looking for more study sites for some of these different projects that I have underway. So if you have any potential sites where you have lots of rats, it's kind of a key aspect. We need lots of rats, not just a few rats. So you have to have a fairly substantial rat problem. But if you do, please reach out to me on that. Secondly, I'll mention if you want more specific detail on any of this, there is, I've been working with Neve Quinn on a UCCE extension publication It's pretty far along. Hopefully it's going to be published here in the next few months, so that'll be a lot more information for you. And then I've also been working with CDFA on putting together a series of videos that kind of go through all of these different processes that we were talking about. So different types of burrow fumigation, different types of traps and trapping, bait application, etc. So those videos are supposed to be available here in the next few weeks to a month or so as well. So hopefully that'll be an extra resource that will be out there for you. And like I said, again, bait stations. If you're looking for bait stations, check with your county ag commissioners for more details on that. And I guess that's where I left it. So I'm happy to take questions if we have some time yet, David.
Yeah, let's go ahead and take one.
I can't see, so.
And front row, go ahead. What do they eat?
Yeah, what do the rats eat?
Question is what do the rats eat?
Yeah.
Well, you know, in these orchard systems, they're primarily eating the crop out there. So pistachios, almonds, anything like that that's out there, they're going to feed on that pretty much year round, right? Because there's almost always something out there that they can scavenge for. If you're in if you're in an area that has snails, they love to eat snails too. This was particularly relevant in citrus. I don't see snails much in pistachios and some of these other nut crops, but they really love snails if you have those around. And then they'll eat insects and they'll eat carrion and they'll eat other rodents and things like that if they can get a hold of them. Rats will eat pretty much anything, so anything they can find out there. But the primary diet is the crop itself. Yeah.
Typically, how long do you have to gas holes either with CO or CO2 in order to get effectiveness?
So there's no data that shows how long is ideal, but for the most part, everybody uses 3 minutes for rats. It does vary a little bit depending upon the species, but right now we're utilizing 3-minute injection times. And I just got some data back of an hour ago or so for the pressurized exhaust. In this case, we're using the Burrow RX. And we were using 3-minute injection times, and so far we're looking at 90+% effectiveness. I mean, that's just 22 Burrow systems so far, but hey, we're starting to collect some data on that front. Okay, that's good. All right, thanks.